Chapter 7. Know your deeds. The Halo arrays are legendary in all civilized space. Among the Covenant remnants, they are something akin to holy weapons. To the former Covenant species, they are effigies of their greatest shame. To humanity, the Halos are a terrifying waiting game. To Admiral Thrasher, the vast majority of her time spent near the Halo arrays was babysitting Stardust and Oni scientists. She wasn't sure which was worse. The 300 ships of Garrison Fleet 3 were likely unnecessary. Yet flood research protocols and whatnot made it necessary. That and the Covenant remnants. The remains of the fleet of Divine Recompense had slipped into far-off space after the assault on the remains of Alpha Halo nearly 2 decades before. That only left the true religious nuts and conspiracy theorists to try and find the others. It also meant that the only eventful things that happened here involved insane people or very lost people, which entailed a simple wiping of their nav drives and memories and dropping them back into relatively civilized space. Installation 01 really was the shit end of the stick. Thrasher was told that this posting was a great honor back when she was promoted. After nearly 2 years at the end of space, she was ready to punch that admiral in the face. "Admiral, we're detecting slipspace ruptures at extreme range," sensors reported, putting his phone down. The bridge shifted from the relaxed and non-regulation positions they'd once inhabited. It was impressive how much grumbling could echo on the command deck of a supercarrier. "Do we have friendly IFFs?" Thrasher pulled herself from her seat and strode to the central projector, shaking sleep from her eyes. The commander of her flagship, Commodore Mizai, had already planted himself head of the display table. "Already pinged, but we're not getting a response." The Commodore replied, "Give them a second. They're probably shitting themselves right now. In the meantime, can somebody set up the interdiction arrays?" A startled "Yes, ma'am" from Quartermaster Leben confirmed the order. The steady thump of the array began to sound through the ship as comms began to speak. "IFF has been established. It's a civilian vessel, ma'am. But I am detecting some irregularities. Should we hail them?" The Admiral suppressed a sigh before waving her affirmative. She walked to the hailing bay, which was the intimidating and awesome part of the bridge designed for hailing people, and gave comms the go-ahead. Again, this civilian vessel disappointed her, taking a full minute to respond to a warship that could literally blow them to pieces. When the screen finally linked, Thrasher knew something was off. The woman, better yet the girl who appeared, looked emaciated and tired, despite the clear layer of fear that was splayed across her face. Her dark red hair looked disheveled and dirty, and her eyes bore the deep circles that told of many sleepless nights, her skin far more pale than the sunlights aboard most ships would allow. Still, Thrasher had to put the fear of God in her. "This is Admiral Castani Thrasher of the UNSC supercarrier Indomitable. You have trespassed in restricted space. State your business." The steel in her voice seemed to have slapped the girl into gear. Her eyes widened momentarily, and the girl began to speak. Hi, this is the UNV. My other spaceship is a car." A pregnant silence hung for a moment. "Oh, I'm her captain, Jessica Shepard." Thrasher felt like laughing at that, but something was wrong. She could feel it. "Why have you come to this area of space? The closest settlement is nearly 60 light-years away." The little color left on Shepard's face drained, though her face remained neutral. "We left Shangxi following the evacuation." The young captain glaced sharply to her left. "Just punched in some random coordinates and jumped out of there, you know?" Thrasher, hell everyone, knew that something had happened on the wayward planet, and yet they couldn't leave a Halo unguarded, or even at half strength. And so they'd stayed and waited for more news. Guess it wasn't a comms malfunction, she thought. What happened? It was a simple question, but the expressions that played across the captain's face were anything but. They were sloppily controlled, yet the effort that was made, "I don't know. We just left after the call was sounded." "I understand, Captain Shepard. Is your vessel in need of repair? It seems like you've taken some damage from some sort of impact." Thrasher was scrolling through the report on the vessel's sensors had just forwarded. Strange gravimetric readings, damage to the hull in numerous positions, evident damage to the slipspace engines. Christ, what happened to this ship? Oh, no thanks, ma'am. We're as cool as a Callisto sunrise here. The whole deck froze at that. She couldn't mean. Drescher faked a chuckle, yet her mind raced as she drawled her own coded response. Cool as Las Vegas captain? As a cucumber, Admiral Drescher. Drescher closed out the conversation, stating she'd need to send an inspection over, as a matter of course. Usually this meant that some Oni spooks would pump the vents with amnestics and reroute the ship the hell out of Dodge. She called Spartan Kilney herself and told her to prepare for a hostage situation. As the screen winked out, the spindles visibly relaxed. Jessa couldn't say the same. Her heart raced and she could barely keep her hands from shaking. She hoped that her code phrase worked. It was an old one Uncle Esser had told her about. She still remembered the stormy gray eyes the Admiral studied her with. She had to hope. The spindles had forced her to take the message from the UNSC fleet, using strange robotic translators to yell at her and threaten her life. They'd also asked questions about the giant circle objects, which she'd feigned ignorance about. Those things looked manic, shouting at each other and yelling, and feeding her bits and pieces of their language, if accidentally. Though to be honest, if she'd only now learned about the halos, well, she'd be freaking out too. The big WMDs in the sky had filtered into mainstream knowledge a few years after the end of the war, and had captured the imagination of the public. More than a few movies had been made about the battle for Installation 04 and the exploits of Spartan 117. They were mostly propaganda and cheesy one-liners, but it had lessened the blow when it came to the existence of end-the-galaxy weapons. That and the Flood, of course. She tried to put those morbid thoughts out of her head, but that only led to pondering her current situation. Right, not better. Just her luck to jump directly into the most dangerous place in the galaxy. She was lucky the UNSC controlled this one, lucky that most things had gone her way, at least for now. The presumed leader looked over from an animated discussion the two aliens were having, probably about the halo. The words Renavauchai came up whenever she was asked about them, when a hail came up on screen. She was quickly ushered back towards the screen as the spindles ran out of view. She pressed the answer key, which displayed an older tan-skinned man named Sorduk by his tag. His hair was graying slightly, and smile lines were etched into his face, a strange contortion given his serious expression. Captain Shepard, we'll be commencing our boarding shortly. Find some cover. Jessa began to ask about the take cover before a sharp crack split the air. She looked up to see a glowing blade embedded in the ceiling, effortlessly cutting a neat circle into the feet of reinforced titanium. The lights shorted as the ceiling caved in, plunging the cabin into darkness and obscuring the blurs of motion that stormed into the ship. An unearthly sound emanated from one of the spindles before it was silenced by shattering burst of weapons fire. Jessa tried to focus on the borders, but saw only strange shimmers and brief, bright disruptions in their invisibility. A spindle launched a purple blob before a hole appeared in its neck. The two others present, well, they exploded. A fat blue beam sent chunks of one flying through the bridge, while another was eviscerated, its greenish guts sent out of the room via the gaping door. Jessa took the scene in. She realized she was holding her breath, so she took one, only to find the sensation painful. Oh. She glanced down and saw a purplish energy, and her blouse shredded utterly. She dimly noted this as her favorite one her mother bought her. She watched with morbid fascination as the energy ate away at her flesh, first bubbling, then blackening the skin around the wound. She stumbled toward the console and found she couldn't breathe. Another figure appeared, this one armored in the unmistakable suit of a Spartan. It was colored a cream white, with a sharp red scar marking the visor. The super soldier scooped the young woman into its arms in a smooth, practiced motion and jumped cleanly back through the hole, into the sterile lights of their craft. The Spartan was gone before Jessa even realized what had happened. A man and a woman dressed in the white and blues of Navy medics rushed to her aid, dragging her suddenly prone body away from the wound in the floor, asking her terse questions like, "What's your name? And how old are you?" One of them said something about a burn, but it felt so far away. Another said biogel and stem cell, or maybe O2. "Stay with us, honey," the man said. He had dreamy eyes. She stared into them for a long time. The bunker shook, again. It was ever-present toss and rumble of airstrikes, artillery, and the more pedestrian explosions. Dr. Kingston rubbed sweat from his brow. A contaminant? Probably, but she figured the soldier wouldn't mind so much. The woman, a reservist by the lack of body armor, had been rushed into his makeshift hospital only a few minutes ago, and with the surgeons busy, it was left to him to operate. He pulled the clamp from his vest and closed a leaking artery, sutured or cauterized the mess of the woman's small intestine left by the peppering of alien bullets, and closed up, hoping that what he'd done had saved a life, at least for a little while. His hands were a bloody thing, caked in the young woman's gore. He hadn't learned her name, so he had nothing to name the bits of intestine and skin that weren't his. He peeled off his gloves and eyed the ever-draining supply of latex in his box. Soon they'd be operating barehanded. He tried to clear his head with a brake. The tide had been stemmed, if for a few minutes, and he slipped from the crush of the operating rooms to the infirmary. Kingston was caught by two well-armed soldiers before he was able to sit down. "Dr. Kingston, you're needed by the general." He bit back a groan before following the two ash-covered men out of his infirmary. His task, dictated to him by the council, had been to set up triage in the lower levels of the civilian bunkers. That plan had been modified when the tunnels into them were collapsed by an enterprising group of alien fucks, forcing his medical teams into the tight and utilitarian military tunnels. It also lost him quite a bit of medical supplies, including the majority of his medical gel. It also gave Lieutenant General Jourdan the idea that the head of triage in Shaanxi was his personal minister. The command chambers lacked the omnipresent scent of blood and death, but made up for it with the baffling amount of people stuffed into one room. Radiomen made up the majority of the chatter in the room and clung to the walls to avoid being swept into the currents of couriers and officers, streaming in and out of a series of small, interconnected corners of concrete and rebar. It would be hard to find anything in the whirlwind of activity here. Anything except General Jourdan, that is. The man was of relatively small stature, though hearing his bellowing orders might have convinced lesser men that he was a beast. The fury of sound made it easy to find the man. Jourdan was verbally assaulting the air marshals, commanding the few fighters left in the skies. The marshals left with all haste, and Jourdan found Kingston's eyes in only moments. "Dr. Well," Jourdan boomed, "come with me. We must talk in private." Kingston frowned at that. Jourdan was not the kind of man that left his post in battle. His private thoughts had distracted him from the general's rapid exit, forcing him to run to catch up. "Where are we going, sir?" the doctor exhaled. "You'll see," he coolly replied. Unnerved by the lack of gusto he said that with, Kingston decided it'd be better to see. The two men traveled quietly, slipping or ramming through a mile of tunnel before reaching the brig. As he wrenched the doors open, he spoke again. "I was told you have some experience in xenobiology, Doctor?" "It was my minor at Georgetown. Yeah. Why?" The door opened and he beheld a raptor. A dead one, hopefully. A sputtering wheeze from the would-be corpse disproved that quickly. The raptor was armored in purplish gray and spattered in a bluish blood. He'd heard the stories about the purple wizards, but he'd hoped to never see one in the flesh. "Oh, fuck me." "Quite. I'll need you to make sure this one lives." He looked at the alien and pondered what could have fucked anything up so badly. Its breastplate was shattered, its head caked in blue blood, which was also pooling on the ground. "I'll also want you to try and speak with it, or find some way to communicate with it. The combat AIs are busy coordinating troops, so their support will be minimal. I'm transferring a xenoarchaeologist to your staff in the meantime. Good luck." The general walked away just as quickly as he came, leaving Kingston with the two station guards and an alien magician. It was easy. Laughable, really. The living ones put up quite a bit of resistance, unknowingly, of course, but their constructs were just stupid. The AI had at first moved cautiously, and then with reckless abandon. She'd pilfered their language databases at first, learning first their names, Turians, a fitting name, I suppose, and then everything about them. A homeworld, the gist of their fleet numbers, technological specs, truly everything needed to wage war. Petabytes of information protected with the metaphorical equivalent of a 3-credit luggage log. It made her somewhat suspicious, really. If it was this easy to access, perhaps this was a trick. Still, even tricks could be helpful in a war. She rationalized it in her mind. Such an underselling of ship capability couldn't possibly be correct anyway. According to their own history, a spacefaring species of nearly 2,000 years couldn't possibly be so weak. She turned off her postulation matrix. The seconds spent running through that were wasted in such a pointless debate. She'd let the Intel AI work on that themselves. She tested for more weaknesses, accessing audio channels with recovered codes. She listened in on troop movements, reports, in a growing sense of awe. Perhaps they were this stupid, or at least this light in InfoSec. Now to find a way to get this info out. She remembered. Or perhaps hidden subroutines had finally been activated. She remembered where survivors of the defense fleet went. The clouds of the far gas giant. She covertly repurposed a satellite dish and set to work crafting a message. The more than one shuddered, as did her admiral. Jones was a wreck, his uniform soiled by blood and sweat. Jump complete, Captain. Navigation breathed. The remainder of the Shaanxi defense fleet, the 5 ships that had limped from battle, had continued their war, if only barely. Jones had ordered a series of raids on the more vulnerable patrol fleets the enemy used to hunt them. On equal terms, his ships could demolish theirs, but it was becoming less and less equal every raid. Their last had landed them in a trap. 4 lagging frigates had simply been bait for a squadron of 10 cruisers and frigates, a force that they couldn't afford to fight. His last destroyer, Jagged Edge, had sacrificed itself to secure a retreat for his others, the 4 ships of his fleet. Just 4. A damage report pinged on his interface and he checked it. A crack in the slipspace drive and a host of other hull and electrical issues that would have to be repaired somehow. The swirling storms of this planet, his crew had named it bitter, perfectly encapsulated his own mind. He couldn't keep doing this, and yet what else could he do? Reinforcements were arriving every day from that thing. The blasted fork? He'd asked long ago why he couldn't just blow that damn thing up with every nuke he had. Apparently the thing held a tremendous amount of energy, which would be a bad idea to destabilize. His AI was keen on making sure he didn't try it anyway. The bastard. How's the rest of the fleet doing? His voice was audibly tired and directed at nobody in particular. He'd been awake for nearly 2 days straight this time. But he couldn't rest yet. Publius is fucked, sir. Her superstructure is barely holding together. Everyone else is battle-ready in about a day. Comms chimed in. She was barely holding together herself with a job that had no breaks. He'd have to remember to put her on bed duty. Okay, tell Publius to remain here. Guard our rear. Admiral, receiving message from enemy fleet. A gasp rang across the deck. Play it. Jones's heart was in his chest. If they'd found his position. A series of beeps and buzzes began to assault the ears of the assembled crew. To Jones, it was the most beautiful thing he'd ever heard. Morse code. They had someone on the inside. Litronox was a proud officer. He'd done a more than good service for the hierarchy. He'd been an astute politicker, a perfect officer, had shredded Batarians under his talons, and yet he could not crush these insolent Varan. He'd been forced to call in reinforcements from a fellow admiral, a man whom he despised in private, and who would now share in some of the spoils. Now he'd been forced to call in the 29th Fleet, with a Primarch's blessing perhaps, but with an implied loss of even more spoils. Litronox wasn't even sure he'd get promoted at the rate he was losing ships to lightning raids by the Prim Remnants. He'd thought he'd had them with his little trap, and yet they'd still managed a hasty retreat, minus a dreadnought at least. This was not to mention the problem of enemy civilians. The tried and true methods of civilian resettlement only seemed to provoke them into violence, which forced his men to reciprocate as doctrine demands. Spirits. This little pacification had turned into a fiasco, one he intended to finish. Litronox was now the commander of over 300 ships, practically at least, and over 100,000 soldiers who were landing as he spoke. These humans, he'd teach them a lesson on interstellar war, whether or not they want to learn. The admiral stalked his way through the bridge of the reticent, plying his men for updates and scowling internally at everyone. His amalgam of generals had only delivered news of delay, retreat, and minor gains. For every slight advance, his forces paid in grotesque piles, blood and bodies. He'd seen what their weapons did to his men. It wasn't pretty. "Admiral," a lowly ensign reported, snapping the crisp salute of an overeager rookie. "Rest, ensign. Speak at your pleasure." Litronox was presented discreetly, a small piece of paper. A strange occurrence in the era of starships and hypercommunications. He took it hesitantly and gave a questioning look to the young woman. "My apologies, Admiral. A message from intelligence." The ensign exited quickly, leaving Litronox to ponder the message. He didn't like what he read. Empty. Not the preferred state of his weapon. Saeed reached and found nothing else. Shit. Across his line, he noted the faces of soldiers down to single mags, or none at all. Fire across the line began to dwindle, and the Raptors were beginning to notice. One of the rail turrets, which had helped hold the line for nearly a day, began to wind down. A Raptor ran diagonally across the small road, from one piece of cover to another, and he managed to make it, shield intact. Its buddies followed suit. His unit's heavy weapons had run dry hours ago. Snipers and beams were drained. Nothing was left but soldiers and half-empty mags. "Grenades? Anyone? I'm fucking dry." Now what? As the remainder of his fire dribbled out, he realized they were out of options. Yet he knew he had to hold. The path they defended led straight into the civilian bunkers for East Landing, still in the process of being evacuated to the better-defended military bunkers still east of here. Those bastards out there could not pass. Nobody knew where the Raptors took the captured civvies, but drones had found bodies. Too many bodies. "Hunker down," Zaid shouted, echoing down the tunnel behind them. He was technically their leader now. He was, after all, the ranking officer. Zaid racked his brain. Just a few more minutes, a few more seconds to get more people out. He had an idea. It was fucking stupid. "Fix bayonets," he screamed. His voice carried down the tunnel, reverberating his insanity for all to hear. There was a pause in the turmoil of the line, then incredulity as more orders bellowed from his mouth. "Wait till the bastards are within 10 meters, then charge. Once we've beaten them back, we fall back down the tunnel." A soldier down the line perfectly encapsulated the feelings of every man and woman on the line at the moment. "What the fuck do you mean, charge?" Zaid jumped on that quickly. "We charge or thousands of fucking people die, soldier. We do this, and we can buy just a bit more time for people to get out. Got it?" Zaid affixed the gleaming blade, standard issue to every enlisted man there was, though perhaps not as awesome as his missing marine plasma blade, and stood before his men. "We do this, and we can save lives, men, so let's fuck those bastards up." Zaid was never much of a public speaker, but hell, his men cheered, albeit briefly, for their suicidal commander. Sporadic gunfire kept the Raptor fucks unsuspecting as they slowly inched their way forward. His own men began to hunker, whispering words and tightening blades. Zaid himself watched near the front as the Raptors slowly realized there was no returning fire now. They themselves seemed surprised by the faltering fire. They crept closer now. The aliens numbered nearly 300. While his own forces had been whittled down to just over 100. He saw one of the Raptors move past the 10-meter mark. He heard it speak, a soft, chittering tongue. He saw another's mandible twitch, a reminder of their mortal enemy a century before. "Charge!" the lieutenant screamed, a cry that only deepened and widened as first 10, then 50, then all 100 defenders jumped over the barricades and sandbags and straight at the bastards. Zaid, by virtue of being the first out, took the first hit, a glancing blow that shredded his face and threw his mind to the void. Aside from some abnormalities in her blood, she's stable. The chief medical officer had delivered the news to Admiral personally. Thrasher had taken a personal interest in this case. She admired the guts it took to stand up to evil damn aliens. Abnormalities? Drescher raised an eyebrow. Indeed, it seems that some sort of foreign matter has lodged itself in her system. I'd venture a guess and say it had to do with the strange wound she sustained during the breach. Keep me updated. I'd like to see her when she wakes up. Drescher picked this moment to leave the doctor's office, though she took a look at the young captain as she made her way to the turbolifts that serviced the ship. The girl was in terrible shape, even to her untrained, distant eye. She'd read reports from the medical officers on duty at the time. "Purple shit just ate her torso," was the quote she'd remembered most. Shepard wouldn't have survived in any other place. She hesitated in calling her lucky, though. Was she really lucky to have survived this? Technicians were still poking through the alien ship, but they'd taken extreme note of the people they'd found, dissected. It was horrifying to look at, truly. Even the possibility that it could be happening at Shen-Shi was too terrible to process. She'd already contacted Earth about her findings and had been told the predictable answer of, "Put your thumb right up it." Fuck that. Shepard was being transported off the ship to the Halo Medical Center. Drescher was going to war. Chapter 8. Sweet and fitting. The sun was rising over the lake, casting brilliant orange and red rays across the boundless water and directly onto the basking Dalatras. She marveled at how far she'd come, how much wealth and influence she'd managed to accrue in her life, how much pain and toil she'd needed to endure to make it here, to the twilight years of her life. Solarians often hid their smiles in the company of strangers, but she couldn't help but beam. Surkesh truly was beautiful this time of the year. She nibbled at her favorite pastry, a liti served with a nice spritz of John sauce. Traditionally, it was only served on Beitao, but hell, she'd earned a bit of indulgence. A grandchild of hers ran up from the beach, a short and sprightly young man who'd probably make a good agent. Gerto, was it? "Dalatras, I wanted to know more about the humans," the little one begged. She ought to discipline him for not calling her grandmother Daltras, but he was too cute to discipline. She'd let his mother deal with that. She motioned for the boy to follow her inside, where a lounge was waiting. "Well, my sweet one, what is it you wish to learn?" The boy made a supremely unique gesture, fiddling with his top antenna. Didn't the child know it was rude to do such a thing? Now she'd have to get up and tell his mother? The boy had his arms crossed, as was expected of a child in deference. His arms still wiggled with his childish excitement, and she couldn't help but smile more. "Well, Mommy said that you were one of the people that discovered the humans. How'd that happen?" "I suppose that's true, young one. My unit was assigned to shadow a Turian patrol fleet when it seems their admiral fell on the wrong side of egotism and started a conflict with a human colony." "How many patrol fleets are there?" A curious question from a child. Perhaps he'd make a good logistician for the fleets. "It's hard to know, something approaching 100 or so. The avian bastards like their feathers numerous." "Where was I?" "Oh yes, in essence we just stumbled in that system, searching for more information. We should have just headed back to report our findings. But I figured we'd make the catch of a lifetime if we sold our information. Elsewhere, shall I say." "Who'd you sell it to?" A feeling tingled at the back of her neck as the room seemed to drop several degrees. "Oh, I believe it was the shadow broker. But that's not so important, little one, shall we?" "Why did you conduct biopsies on the humans you captured?" That was not information she'd shared with anyone but the STG. "Now, where did you get the idea of that?" She watched as time rewound. Watched the young boy rewind. A blur of motion that ended right back before she'd... What happened after that? The child continued as if time itself hadn't broken down. What just happened there?" "What do you mean, Grandmother Dalatras?" The boy looked quizzically, eyes narrowing impossibly. Shrinking was a better word. The terrace was no longer warming with the sunrise. A chill breeze swept her into freezing cold. The golden rays of the sun faded, replaced by sterile lighting and great flares of light. The view outside had become stilted. She noticed a shadow missing, first on one tall wind-blasted tree, and then everywhere. The lake went from calmly lapping at the shore to practically stagnant. "Wait, Where am I? Her voice shivered, the calm authority and grace seeping away. Who assigned you to your mission? The boy said, mouth motionless. She gasped and moved a step away, before suddenly finding herself strapped to a hard metal chair. Get away from me! Guards! She called shrilly. There are no guards here. Give us what you know. The Solarian thrashed against the binds as reality gave way. First the trees melted, yielding to the harsh light that enveloped the very air. Then came the walls as an oily gray began to overtake the clean whites of her villa. The child next as it morphed into the rough, humanoid shape of a hazmat suit. She tried to will her biotics to flare, but they sputtered weakly, even if they forced the human to step back. She looked around the room and found herself surrounded. Humans, all in enviros, manned stations and buttons. They chattered in the deep, yet musical tones she'd come to know from her own studies. It seems the roles had finally been reversed. But then went the memories. She could feel the glorious days of her past wither, her accomplishments die away. She tried to hang on to her most precious memories, her first laying, the hatching ceremony, her enthrallment to the Dalatras Committee. All of it began to wither away like a leaf in fall, crisping and yellowing, till naught was left but the stem, the memory of memory. She began to scream, but then it became a sob, a wail of loss impossible to distinguish as naught but sorrow. She began to remember her capture, the massive things that eviscerated her team. That took her captive. Return her to alpha status and remember the readjustments we made to the scenario interrogator. We've only got a few more wipes before she a vegetable. She closed her eyes, if only to escape the horrors of the now, and return to a peaceful lake. The sun was rising over the lake, casting brilliant orange and red rays across the boundless water and directly onto the basking Dalatras. Dr. Kingston was getting tired of this alien's bullshit. The alien had been generally quiet the last few hours, as he and it had spent that time in what could generously be described as a room together. Before that, it had been mostly inane attempts at getting it to understand English. He'd given it water, called it such, and presented that water to it. Since it was obviously intelligent, the fact that it said nothing back was likely meant to irritate him. The alien was behind a thick plexiglass plate with nothing but a rough-looking bed to keep it company on its side of the glass. Kingston had taken a glass of water himself, drank some of it, and then presented it to the alien to drink. This glass was also ignored, though he could swear he saw its eyes twitch towards it. The few other captured Turians he'd managed to wrangle into his makeshift POW camp had been more or less the same. You'd think they'd appreciate him saving their lives. It wasn't exactly easy to root around in alien bodies to try and find out how they worked. Perhaps they didn't appreciate being naked. He'd try fabricating clothes soon enough. The bunker rumbled. This deep in the complex, it was barely a whisper of noise and movement, which sent the doctor on his own bout of pacing. If he hadn't been carefully watching, he might not have caught the quick movement of the alien towards the glass of water. Kingston turned, just in time to see the thing quickly take the water and make its way back to the bed. Yes, drink it. It's safe. See. He took his own glass of water and drank it, trying to calm his jubilance at the same time. The alien was still cautious, first opening its three-pronged mouth and dipping its tongue into the glass. After a few moments of contemplation, the raptor drank. Thank God! Kingston collapsed into the wall. He'd done it. Finally. He pointed to what remained of the water. Water? He repeated the gesture a few more times before asking it, in a roundabout way, if it wanted more water. He then realized that it didn't know how to say yes or no in Raptor, and decided to just keep repeating himself till it decided to say water back. Eventually, the alien got the memo. Vontour, it ventured after finishing the rest of its glass. Kingston leapt in the air. Yes, water! The alien, well, he couldn't tell if it was happy too, but the doctor certainly was. Progress was progress, he supposed. He left the room for a moment before returning with a tray of both water and an old ration pack. Bland, but still edible. Every human on Shang-Chi could attest to that. Water, he pointed to the small glass. Food. He pointed to the small paper package, activating the built-in heater before opening it, and shoving a handful of what could generously be called pasta into his mouth. He'd chosen the least offensive meal left, and plain pasta probably fits that description. However, the alien was less interested in this show of fraternity. First, it simply refused. It didn't even take the cooling bag from his hands. It crossed its arms and turned its head away. At least some body language was similar. He repeated his attempts to serve the meal, but it only reiterated its no. He took this opportunity to try and teach it no, mimicking its movements while saying no. Eventually it seemed to work, and when Kingston tried to offer the food again, the raptor said, "No." Kingston sighed and sat back down on the floor. This was gonna take forever. That's when the bastard decided to get helpful. He pointed to the still smoldering MRE and made a gun-shaped gesture with his hand before pointing it at himself. "Oh, come on, the pasta isn't that... Wait." He grabbed the pasta and took a bite before exaggeratedly falling to the floor, clutching his stomach. He looked at the alien as it began to make sound. "Yes," it said suddenly, almost excitedly, before pointing at first the food and then the prone doctor. "You fucker! You really did learn something." Kingston took the food and left quickly. The autopsied Turian soldiers had, with luck, not been incinerated yet. He had more tests to run, but he was onto something. "This sounds preposterous." "Respectfully, Admiral, the evidence does not lie. The head of Fleet Intelligence, once a woman that had nothing more to do than admonish horny privates about sending nudes home, was holding a secret meeting with Admiral Litronox about an apparent infiltration in their ranks. She wasn't ready for that, and it was written all over her face. How did this happen? Litronox reined in his fury for the barest of moments to bark out his displeasure. The head pulled every ounce of disciplinary rigor she had to keep from stuttering. "I don't know, sir. I was alerted to a minor discontinuity in docking logs by one of our VIX subroutines. It wasn't deemed all that important in relation to the battlefield scouring that is normally done. However, once a series of incongruities began to show up..." "You called me down here, yes?" Litronox growled. "Yes, sir." The Admiral stalked to one of the far-off corners of the essentially impregnable conference room at the heart of the reticent. There he screamed, a howl of pure and unadulterated rage. It shocked the head, shocked the Admiral himself. He gathered himself, panting briefly in his little corner, before walking back to his subordinate with a practiced calm. "Do we have any way to deal with this problem?" Litronox ground through his mandibles. "Unfortunately, all we have found so far has been evidence of a breach. We can't isolate whatever Zisk they're using." "Then what else can you do?" Litronox replied curtly. "Well, sir, several of my analysts concur that with the sheer determination the humans have displayed defending the tower, along with the high amount of radio traffic emanating from the spire..." Litronox stormed out of the room, prompting the beleaguered officer to follow. "It may be possible that it's their center of..." Litronox was already down the hall. "Intelligence." The Admiral barely even waited for his personal guard as he stormed through the winding tunnels and corridors of the ship. Perhaps it would be more convenient to use the turbolifts, but his rage demanded some act of physical expression, and ripping his way through the walls of an elevator would have been remarkably unseemly. His men, once the word spread of the mood of the Admiral, stayed far out of the way. The bridge was quiet as the Admiral entered. The murmuring of officers and runners, the light sounds of work, all seemed to fall away as the Admiral entered. "Weapons, spin up our primary mass accelerator. I'm sending you target coordinates on planet now." A look of surprise crossed the face of the officer, who began to protest. "Sir, Citadel conventions. Do I look like I give a piejack's ass about the fucking conventions?" Litronox thundered across the deck. De Sola, as sub-admiral, was already on deck subbing for the Admiral, and practically shouted at his superior officer, "Admiral Litronox, please! The officer is correct." De Sola tried to take his friend to the side, but Litronox only shoved him off, wheeling his anger on his subordinate. "My orders are final, Sub-Admiral. The Spire has been a thorn in the side of our advance for nearly a week. A calculated strike by an orbital cannon could drop the shield. Or get you court-martialed. Us court-martialed," De Sola whispered fiercely. All eyes were on the two admirals. Much of the fleet was likely wondering why the reticent had climbing energy readings. What other choice do we have, brother? If this siege goes on too long, if it does, we'll face consequences, but that doesn't compare to execution. I tire of your insolence, Desola. If this is forced to continue, there will be repercussions. Desolas was taken aback. Sir, please, you know what will happen if they find out. Latrinox had some retort in the back of his throat, but was interrupted by the deep and resonating thud that was unmistakable to any serviceman. Latrinox weathered the role well enough. However, he still wheeled on the frantically typing officer at weapons, still battling, blaring red and white screens. I don't know what happened, sir. The main gun just fired. Where? Barked Latrinox as he ran to weapons' readout. Spirits. The coordinates are set towards the planet, aimed at one of our fobs. A dark look crossed the Admiral's face, and his mandibles began to twitch. Do we have time to warn them? I've already sent them an all-call, but it'll be impacting in less than 10 seconds. Comms had already begun their frantic calls toward the surface and towards the rest of the fleet, and Latrinox stood alone, searching the ragged surface of Shanxi, trying to see if his eyes could spot the coming fireball. A minute of fruitless watching left only a knot of hatred in his soul. He turned. Soldiers of the hierarchy. He had to speak loudly to be heard over the horror of the now. We have been compromised by enemy infosec. I am locking down all unregulated communications from this ship and will begin preparations for further security sweeps. The room had settled into unadulterated shock. Turian cybersecurity was some of the best in existence. Dreadnoughts were especially impenetrable. I am authorizing an orbital strike on the area that we have designated Spire. I'm prepared to deal with the consequences of that decision. We must prevent this species' continued attempts at dishonorable tricks and calculated monstrosity. This is the only way our forces can prevail. Weapons? The officer looked up from his readouts. What is the status of our main gun? Whatever their team did, it simultaneously shorted the super magnets in the barrel while firing. We're out of commission till we can recalibrate. Order some of our vessels to carry out the order then. I shall be coordinating our security sweep. Desolas, you have command. The Admiral strode from his position, leaving the bridge to jump back to action. However, Desolas quickly chased after the Admiral. Admiral, I still don't think... Latrinox did not even turn to speak. Sub-Admiral, do not think my orders mere suggestions. Desolas stared dumbly as his friend walked away. The bombardment began shortly after the first shell impacted. Some had thought it was simply an accident. After all, why target their own troops? The next hit the shield directly and shook the very air. Colonel Williams knew that eventually luck would run out for his little fortress. After the storming of the East Landing garrison, morale had somehow broken the rock bottom it had already plummeted to. Every round that impacted the shield splintered their resolve evermore. Still, he was surprised by how long it was taking. Maybe the colonial government was right about spending the billions of credits for a hard light barrier. One of the men who'd stayed behind sent something to his neural lace. Ah, shield's at 10%. He supposed now was as good a time as ever to start. Most personnel had evacuated ages ago. He'd somehow convinced a Spartan to do the same. All that was left in the rapidly shrinking bubble shield was the spire, a few Honegers, and of course the frigate. The Merry Dancer had become something of a hospital ship in its brief time under siege in the spire. It was behind two sets of shields after all, and was at least mostly sterile, making it ideal for the severely wounded. Anyone too screwed up to make it through the tunnels towards the military hospitals was placed in there. Now it was the last ride out of hell on Shanxi. The tunnels had collapsed under the sheer kinetic strain of being near the bombardment. So now about 1,000 people were on board a ship meant for 300. He didn't want to be the captain leading that. He chuckled darkly at that, even if he couldn't hear it. An enveloping wall of sound had forced the colonel to the ground as a terrible rumbling signaled the latest shell. He heard a subsequent cacophony as one of the nearby hangars collapsed under the stress. A subtle chirp in the back of his head told him about the status of the shield, but he didn't bother this time. Based on the previous pattern, he still had about 30 seconds until another round smashed the shield into bits, along with everyone left. However, he was far more cognizant of the prowling alien ships lurking behind the mountains. watching for any weakness to exploit. The skeleton of the skeleton crew that was left in the command center numbered maybe 3. Comms was mostly deaf at this point, hence the constant messages, and the engineer, apparently the lead on the space elevator base they were currently inhabiting, was on the shield display, also mostly deaf. He sent a quick message to the man, who looked his way and nodded. He lowered the shield. See, it was hard opening slip space inside a damn bubble shield, especially if the shield was basically as wide of a nicely sized football stadium. He watched as the dancer rose gracefully through her hangar doors, splitting them effortlessly apart. A deep vortex of blue appeared before the craft, causing a shift in local pressure that popped his ears. The deep oranges and reds of the waning sun cast rays of light across the smoldering battlefield, catching the drifting mountains of smoke with a reddish gleam. The light glinted off the starship as it soundlessly drifted through the portal. It was a sight few had witnessed with their own eyes, slip space in atmosphere. One he imagined the alien ships struggling to catch the dancer surely didn't appreciate. The portal was already closing as he brought his mind back to his daughter. He remembered how she'd refused to see him off as he left for his tour. Teenagers were like that, short-sighted. He knew it was because she loved him, but that didn't make it hurt less. He tried to remember the last time he saw Ashley, the last time he'd hugged her. He let that warmth fill his body, his mind. He watched the portal close from only a kilometer away. He didn't stand a chance. Meetings with the board of admirals went one of 2 ways: intensely boring or like a kick to your groin, painful and often nauseating. The Chancellor felt the latter heavily. When she was in the service, her responsibilities were primarily herself and her subordinates. Now she commanded nearly 4 billion soldiers, sailors, and enlisted men. That failed to mention the 40 billion other souls that elected her. Still, she wouldn't let them walk all over her. Full mobilization seems like a significant overreaction to what we currently know. Patricia placated again. Grand Admiral Shield was a warmonger, plain and simple. He had 2 default states at the table: wants more military spending, or let's teach those alien bastards a lesson. The man was born just a few generations late, and everyone at the table knew it, including him. Why in God's name should we wait? Those alien bastards could be glassing Shanxi as we speak. Shield sat down in a huff, his lanky frame contorting remarkably to fit the chair. That is something we all can agree on, Shield, the Lord Admiral granted. But we can't throw the entire galaxy's economy into shambles for one agri-world, especially without sending any scouts first. His commanding tone settled Shield's side of the table down, momentarily at least, allowing the smooth voice of Minister of Defense Zimmerman to speak. Should we not make haste in our decision, Chancellor? As much as Oni enjoys keeping secrets, all eyes shifted to the conspicuously absent Admiral of Intelligence's seat. The lid's gonna blow on alien invasion eventually. Could we at least redirect some of the garrison fleets around installation? Garrison's Admiral Church sat up in her chair. You know the importance of those fleets as much as I do, Zimmerman. The Chancellor held up a hand. Perhaps the man is right, Church. There hasn't been a threat on the Halos in over a decade, a credible threat in far longer. Chancellor, you of all people should know the dangers of— That'll be quite enough, Admiral Church. Steele had ringed her voice for just a moment, and the woman awkwardly slunk into her chair. Our containment on all flood-bearing bases, including the Array Minister Zimmerman pointed out, is more than sufficient to deal with any flood outbreak, even at half strength. I understand your trepidation, Admiral, but it is baseless. An aide approached the Lord Admiral before bending down and whispering in his ear. The dark, angular room was oddly juxtaposed by the crisp white of the Admiral's formal dress. She wondered how much bleach the board's dry clears even buy. I take it you'll be ordering Installation 01's garrison to depart? The Lord Admiral asked. Her daydream interrupted. She refocused. I will be, Lord Lasky. Do you have objections to this order? The man smiled wryly. I don't, Chancellor, though it seems Admiral Drescher has beat us to the punch. You're shitting me. Church sank deeper into her chair. Please don't tell me she took the whole fleet. Church sighed. It seems your personal wild card has escaped your sleeve again, Kilney. Zimmerman japed. Can it, Mike, or I'll lump you into the court-martial too? Wait, Shield choked. You put that drescher in charge of Installation 01? The Tipley Gaff drescher? The Admiral burst into laughter, taking the rest of the table with him. Patricia struggled against her own good humor, before herself cracking a smile. The Tipley Gaff was a severe overreaction to a smuggler operation that embarrassed the whole UNSC. It was also hilarious, at least in private. I thought a garrison duty would cool her off. Church trailed. To be fair, Kilney, an ice bath on Europa wouldn't cool that one off. The Lord Admiral chuckled. Luckily, she didn't take the whole fleet. Apparently, she has good intel that enemy numbers were approaching 59 ships. She departed with only 2/3 of her force. The mention of ship numbers brought everyone back to Earth. Where'd she get that? Patricia asked. An escaped cargo hauler. Apparently they were hijacked by some kind of alien research team. Got lucky with a random jump. We're receiving intel from ONI DataSec now. We'll have a preliminary report in 15. The mirth of a few moments prior had been strangled out. Everyone knew what research team meant. Still, I can't condone such a reckless misuse of resources, especially in relation to Halo containment. Church eked, a serious tone finally reestablished. Overkill is always better than defeat, Admiral. I suppose Drescher has taken that to heart. The Lord Admiral managed a slight grin. Admiral Shu will be getting a briefing on alien biology and technology shortly. And don't worry, Admiral, I've already alerted one of our research hulks that will have new specimens inbound. The quiet, gray-haired Admiral relaxed in his chair, nodding thanks. General Olna, I'll be forwarding you the report on general biology and weapon specs for the enemy, though I'm sure you'll be happy to know they don't stand up to Spartans that well. Which leaves me. The Chancellor stood, catching the table off guard and sending most of them into a sudden rise themselves. I'll work on scheduling a press conference. Get me that briefing soon as you can. And Zimmerman, please brief the Defense Committee as soon as possible. I don't want the Assembly calling me a tyrant again if I can help it. Of course, Madam Chancellor. He always did that after an order, and as annoying as it was, she had to admit how snazzy Madam sounded. As she left the meeting and boarded the elevator up, Amori joined her, rising from his languished sitting position. Why is it you sit like that? She asked, trying to purge the impending dread of breaking the shittiest news imaginable from her mind. Why not, madam? Amori deflected her attempt at conversation so utterly she paused, simply to regard such a smarmy robot. I suppose I just assumed possessing a physical body would be something you'd hold in much more regard. I've seen humans drink before, Chancellor. Perhaps I should feel the same way. The elevator dinged, and she secretly thanked the machine for having saved her from coming up with a response to that. There was something to be said for surviving 2 in-atmosphere slip-space jumps. They sucked. John started to wonder if perhaps luck was a double-edged sword. Sure, it meant he survived things, but it also meant that he had to dwell on them, and dwelling on the fact that he's probably survived more explosions than any other man in existence really wasn't a comforting prospect. By the time John had chosen to leave, the tunnels leading out had partially collapsed, meaning that much of his escape had to be made on foot. The rubble of the building he'd taken cover in coated everything in a fine layer of swirling dust. The twilight had been rendered into near-perfect darkness by the thick plumes of smoke and ash. Glowing flakes of purple glittered in the smoky haze, and for a moment he was back in Mombasa, dodging plasma rounds and shaking off the screams. Cortana, Chief ventured, feeling his way out of the ruins of his impromptu shelter. Glad to see you're not dead, big guy, Cortana chirped. What are these things? He pushed a slab of granite out of the doorway before pausing to catch one of the small purple wafers drifting to the floor. I don't know. Imaging on your suit cam suggests that it has a similar radiological makeup to scans of the Fork and of the alien ships. My advice, don't take off your helmet anytime soon. Chief placed the flake into one of his specimen pouches. Should I take tasting them off the list too? He reached for his plasma pistol and found it right where he'd left it. Ha ha. Motion tracker's picking up movement about 20 meters north, but it's not staying consistent. Might just be debris. Wait, do you hear that? I hear it. He thought it was part of his memory, but it wasn't going away. Is that crying? Jon was already stalking toward the sound. It didn't take long to find the source. The boy was covered in blood, weeping over a mess of bloody meat. The boy was covered by the purple shards, the muted flecks of violet caught by the brackish reds of blood. Jon only watched, the grip on his gun relaxing, then slipping from his hand. The boy heard the small commotion, jumping up and revealing a female corpse, crushed by falling chunks of rebar and stone. Her face wasn't anything recognizable, just chunks of flesh that seemed to coat the young boy in gore. The child screamed and raced to hide further within the rubble. "Wait!" Jon shouted, leaping to try and catch the boy. He covered the space in only 2 bounds, trapping the boy between himself and the ruined mess of his mother. The child tried to spin around, but only ended up tripping on the loose rubble, falling on his back. The Spartan wanted to reach for the boy to stop his pointless struggle, but he realized how much more terrifying he must have looked compared to the raptors. The boy pushed himself back, far from the Spartan's outstretched hand, till he was backed into a corner. Jon holstered his weapon as the boy began to speak. "Get away from me!" he shouted, a rock held high above his head. It was a pitiful threat against a Spartan, and yet Jon raised his hands. "I'm not here to hurt you," he said calmly. "I'm just like you." He let his arms fall to his sides. It was almost laughable to say that standing nearly 2 meters tall in a giant metal suit, but that was all he had. The boy didn't seem to buy it either, and only seemed to tighten his grip on the rock. "I'll prove it to you." Jon dropped to one knee before reaching up and pulling off his helmet. The boy reared to throw his rock, but stopped when he saw Jon's face. Tension seemed to flow from the boy's body, and he dropped his rock, staring at the newly human hulk of metal. "What's your name?" Jon asked tentatively. "I'm Kayden." The boy shot out. "Are you a Spartan?" Jon was taken aback by the question. He hadn't been expecting it. "I assumed you were an alien because I didn't recognize your armor. But if you're that big, you have to be one." Jon looked at the helmet he was holding. It was scarred on one side, its faceplate shattered by a brute shot a century before, his armor battered and shredded in 100 places by 1,000 things, old and new. To think he'd gotten it from Cairo so long ago, shiny and new. "I am," Jon finally answered, before returning the helmet to his head. "We should get somewhere safe." The boy looked around, taking in the ruins of the city around him, lingering on the creeping puddle of blood. "I guess so." The boy got to his feet warily before walking toward Jon. "Where should we go?" "I know a place." "Then I'll follow you."